They say silence is golden. I say silence is a creature that learns to walk inside your house and then refuses to leave. It sits on the edge of the sofa. It breathes from the hallway. It listens. My silence wasn't peaceful. It was patient, patient the way a cat waits at a closed door, patient the way a heart waits to be asked a question it has forgotten how to answer. My name is Clara. I'm 49. Divorced. No children. I spend my days editing other people's love stories for a living, which, if you think about it, is the most public form of private grief. I shape endings for a living while my own chapters drift in the margins, dog-eared and muted. My mornings begin with the hiss of the kettle and the exact ritual of 2 teaspoons, 1 sugar. My evenings end with the same paperback open at the same line. Over time the little things stack up and become the architecture of your life. You stop noticing the cracks until someone else knocks on your door. He entered like a knock, polite, small, ordinary. Malik. 21. Delivery boy. Soft dreadlocks, a hoodie that was always a little wet on the cuffs, eyes dark enough to hold a story if he ever chose to tell it. He started bringing my groceries on Fridays. At first, he was just another boy with a bag and a receipt. But people don't arrive to the edges of your life without changing the light in the room. He asked how I was, not the quick, meaningless how are you, that people use to fill silence, but like he wanted an answer. You okay, Miss Clara? His voice made my name feel like a small present. I watched myself straighten my shirt in the hallway mirror and I realized, with the gentle horror of someone who has found blonde hair at the sink, that I was noticing him. If you're watching this and you felt that small, almost embarrassing flutter when someone new looks at you and suddenly the mirror is an enemy and an ally at once, tap like. Stay. Don't skip what comes next. It started raining that Friday. Not a polite drizzle but a rain that came in from the edges of everything, pressing the city small and close. It drummed on the windows with a wet, impatient rhythm. Malik arrived late. Late enough for me to think he might not come at all. Late enough for my chest to have learned to expect disappointment. He stood under my porch light, soaked, hoodie heavy on his shoulders, a smile that looked frayed at the edges. He apologized like a ritual. I told him not to worry. The rain made it easier to let him in. Come in for a minute, I said before I could stop myself. I hate how hospitable one becomes when the house is too quiet. The first time he crossed my threshold he did it the way a tide slides into an unfamiliar bay, hesitantly, then with a confidence that seemed inevitable. He took off his hoodie like a small surrender. I handed him a towel. Our fingers brushed. It felt like the long, slow drumroll right before something obvious happens and everyone in the audience knows what the hero will do, except sometimes the hero hesitates. That hesitation is everything. We sat with 2 mugs, the kettles his soft as breath. He talked about school, about photography, about trying to capture people when they aren't aware of themselves. You could hear the honesty in him because it wasn't trying to sound like anything it wasn't. He said the light in my living room made people look like they had been paused between chapters. He said it with a reverence you only give to things you notice when you're used to being unseen. I blushed, ridiculous, but the way he looked at me felt criminal and kind all at once. When someone makes you feel like you matter again, it is tempting to fold your old life away and pretend a new one fits. I wanted that. I also wanted to be sensible. I was both, dangerous in my restraint. That night the rain wrote a lullaby on the roof and Malik accepted my offer to stay. The guest room is clean, I said, and something in me clicked like a lock tumbling open. You ever offer shelter to a stranger and then realize the thing you offered was yourself? We told each other small truths. He told me about photographing strangers on trains. I told him editing had eaten my patience for surprises. We built a map of soft confessions. But soft confessions are bridges that swing when the tide changes. Pause here. If this is the part where you think sweet, predictable, know that story rarely stays predictable for long. Morning came like a dare. I walked past the guest room and the door was ajar. The sunlight had sat on the floorboards like a letter someone left on a table and forgot to take. There he was, asleep, hair splayed on the pillow, the kind of sleep that doesn't know it is being watched. Something tender unhooked inside me. You tell yourself you should leave, should pull the blanket off, should go back to your small, safe script, but you don't. You stand at the edge, a voyeur to your own life. He joined me in the kitchen, clean and boyish, curls damp, the clothes I had lent him hung with the casual indifference of someone who has been handed a gift and hasn't decided if they'll keep it. He asked me, out of nowhere, if he could photograph me. I laughed and told him I wasn't camera material. He said that was the point. He wanted me unmade. The lighting right now is soft, he said. You will look like a sentence. People take photographs of you and make you believe in things you forgot you owned. He showed me the photos later, not perfect, sometimes out of focus, sometimes framed wrong, and there I was, alive in a way the mirror hadn't remembered. It's a small miracle to find yourself stranger than your reflection. That night, something shifted. Not loudly. Not the crescendo of a film score. Just the steady tilt of a world that's been off balance for a long time finally giving. I knocked on his door with a blanket. He opened, sleepy-eyed, wearing the sweatpants I had lent him. Our fingers touched. He said thank you like gratitude for more than a blanket. That touch lingered, a resident ghost in my bones. We did the unuttered. There was no rush. No storybook scene. Only the quiet warmth of two bodies learning a geography of comfort they had denied themselves. He lay beside me and placed his hand on my waist with a gentleness that felt like a truce. He didn't ask for labels. I didn't offer alibis. We held each other's breathing as if breathing could stick us together long enough to believe in morning. But alongside the comfort, the house, that habitual, reliable silence, started to change its tone. There were small things. The kettle left on a minute too long, a folded receipt in the wrong pocket, the clock in the hallway that skipped a number one night. Tiny errors, but the brain is a detective. It notices pattern breaks. It keeps evidence like ants keep crumbs. This is where the suspense grows. Notice the small details. They matter. After that night, things happened in quiet accelerations. Malik's visits became less tied to Friday deliveries. He came at odd hours. He would appear with a CD of music he liked. He left pictures on my bookshelf. He started changing the light bulbs in the living room. He said the old ones made me look tired. He learned my favorite tea and burned it once to show me he wasn't perfect. I loved him for that small imperfection. Loving someone for their burn is the adult way of saying you accept scorch. And then there were moments when he stood by the window for too long, looking out into the street, and I would see a shadow cross his face that didn't belong to me. He would answer his phone quickly and step into the hall, and the conversation would become a river I could not cross. He would come back with a smile that didn't reach his eyes, and for a second the house would remember to be echoing again. One evening I found, tucked inside the trash bag, a receipt from a different grocery store, a timestamp a little late, a note scribbled on the back with a name I didn't know. I held that scrap like evidence in a detective novel and felt ridiculous for wanting a subplot in my life. I shoved it into a drawer and told myself it was nothing. Humans are very good at convincing themselves of nothing when nothing is uncomfortable. Sometimes nothing is a rumor. Sometimes it is a warning. He'd look at me like he wanted to tell me things but couldn't. He'd trace the rim of my cup and then look away. There were nights he slept at my place and mornings he didn't. There were afternoons when I came home and his camera bag was missing, though he'd taken it out with him in the morning. The distances he kept and then closed felt like a tide chart I didn't understand. One night, the clock read 2:17 a.m. The air outside had the salt of a storm that never arrived. I woke because the hallway floorboard creaked, a cadence I had memorized, but that night the creak repeated twice, spaced like a code. Then silence. I lay in bed counting the breaths of the sleeping city and the sleeping boy in my house. Then the doorknob turned softly. Not the clumsy turn of a forgetful stranger, but the precise turn of someone used to doors and to knowing what waits on the other side. He stood in my room in the moonlight, shirtless and bare, but not the same boy. His jaw had set like someone whose night's work had been to rehearse a script into his bones. I asked if he was okay. He didn't answer right away. He lifted his hand and the apartment seemed to hold its breath like a witness in a courtroom. "You should be careful," he said. Not loud, not threatening, but the words landed like an object on a table. I asked him what he meant. He said, There are people who notice things. He looked toward the window. I followed the sight line. Nothing but the street, dim and obedient. He sat on the bed, and for a moment there was the boy again, the one who said things like "you make me feel calm," and then he was gone. That too was ambiguous. Was he warning me? Trying to build a secreted confidence around me? Or was he telling me something about himself? I had to hold two possibilities in my hands and decide which to put in my pocket. If you like the tension so far, hit that subscribe button, because things are about to get quieter in ways that aren't comforting. Small intrusions kept happening. A camera left on the coffee table with a few new images that weren't of me, photos of another woman, a street corner, a door, all innocuous until you notice the timestamp, the night before I let him in. There was a business card slipped into the pages of my book with the name of a place I didn't recognize. I began to see patterns the same way a person starts to see constellations in random stars, by wanting them to mean something. During the days I told myself I was being silly. During the nights I told myself I was observant. Both were true, and both were convenient for the side of me that wanted to stay. People who return home to a changed silence do one of three things: they leave, they confront, or they make room for certain kinds of mysteries. I chose the third for reasons that are selfish and honest. I needed what I had received. And want is a poor ethic for safety. The tension is rarely violent the way movies teach us, it's corrosive. It works like small acids on the edges of trust. It eats the glues. You notice it in the way your hands shake while making tea, in the way you answer the phone with fewer words, in the way you start to catalogue the furniture of evenings as either safe or suspect. One afternoon there was a knock at my door that didn't belong to any courier. A woman stood there with a child clinging to her coat. She asked for Malik. My heart did that unnatural thing where it drops and then rushes simultaneously. I invited her in because forgetfulness has its own politeness. The woman looked too young, face like pebble, smile like someone who has wrapped a bruise. She asked me if I'd seen Malik for a moment, then her voice pulled tight and she said, "People talk." I felt the word like a cold coin in my hand. People talk. About what? About the way he looks at me. About the way he slips out at night? About the other woman in the photographs? She sat on my couch with the child in her lap. The child kicked a small rhythm against fabric. The woman told me she and Malik used to know each other in a way that involved arguments about borrowed money and promises delivered late. She said things to soften my surprise. "He's a good boy. He just gets into messes." She fixed me with a quick, sharp look. "Don't make the mistake of thinking you can fix other people's stories," she said, and then she left like someone who had sealed a letter. When the door clicked behind her, the silence swelled thicker, like an old blanket dragged across the room. Malik came home that night and smelled faintly of cigarettes and another perfume. He said nothing about the visit. But he did not kiss me. He stood in the doorway and watched me the way one watches a painting one is not allowed to touch. I wanted to demand answers. I wanted to demand loyalty. Instead I pretended I didn't hear the question spiraling out from my throat. There are choices that feel like small betrayals because they are the soft compromises you make in order to keep a tenderness intact. I let the not knowing live beside me for a while. I let the pictures be pictures. I let the woman be a woman who had reason to be angry. But secrets do not always stay secret because the people who keep them hope they will. Secrets leak in gestures and in the way a person moves their shoulders, in the offhand answers to straightforward questions. One night, in the kitchen, he left an envelope on the table as if dropping a breadcrumb. Inside was a photograph of me, a single image taken from the street, the bottom edge of the frame caught in the shadow as if it had been sneaked. I turned the photo over. No note. My name wasn't on it. Only the timestamp and the glare where the flash had been. My stomach clenched like a fist. At that moment the story I had been telling myself, that he was kind, that this was simply a strange romance between mismatched people, split. Out of the split something else came, the possibility that I had been the subject of a project I did not consent to. And an older part of me, the cautious part built during the long marriage, asked, "What are you going to do?" I could have done many things. I could have opened the door and demanded truth. I could have called someone. I could have told him to leave. Instead I decided to watch, because watching was what I was trained to do. Editors watch. We watch for the bad cuts, the jumpy sentences, the frames that betray the story. I watched Malik. He moved through my life with a devotion that was at once tender and strategized. He learned where I kept the tea bags. He learned my reading habits. He started to bring me small things from the markets he visited, jars of spices with labels in different languages, a pressed flower in a book. He arranged my photographs. He seemed to be composing a life that included me like a centerpiece. Then one night, the house did something it hadn't done before. It made a sound not from itself but from outside, a low, repeating tap at the window like a Morse code that wanted to be translated. I got up and walked to the window. There, on the sill, a small envelope lay like a mailbird that had lost its way. Malik was in the kitchen making tea, his back to me and the light haloing his shoulders. He didn't know I had found it. I picked it up and inside was a train ticket and a set of numbers. His name was on the corner in a handwriting I didn't recognize. And beneath it, a single sentence in a different hand: "We watch because we love." I could have laughed. I could have cried. Instead I went to him like someone carrying a slow fuse and I asked, simply, "Who's watching us?" He turned. For the first time in months his eyes did not find the floor. He looked at me, just me, and he said, "No one you need to worry about." His voice was level. I believed it, and I didn't. We both know the difference. The truth always has a texture, lies have an edge. From that moment the lines of the story blurred. Sometimes he was the loyal presence who made tea. Other times he was absent for days. He laughed with me in the living room and then stood on the rooftop at midnight looking down at the street like he was reading the city for clues. He would come back with a face that had seen something he didn't want to tell me. He would place photographs on the table that weren't of me. I would touch them and they were warm still, like someone had just moved from behind the frame. One night, about 3 weeks after he first knocked, he woke me by shaking my shoulder and saying, "Come." He was pale and his hands were trembling as if he'd been running. He pushed me to the window and pointed to the far end of the street. There, in the halo of a street lamp, 2 figures stood talking in the rain. I could not tell who they were but calluses of recognition smoothed across my skin. He whispered, "They watch." The 2 figures didn't move. When they turned, I saw the silhouette of the woman who had knocked at my door weeks before. Her face was turned away. She didn't see us. What I wanted next was a confrontation, a neat scene where questions are shouted and truths ascended like steam. Instead the night unrolled into a long, delicate hush. We sat on the couch and drank cold tea until the sun came and the watchers vanished like sleep. I realize now that suspense is often a long, patient ritual, an accumulation of small scares until the final item clicks into place. The climax of this particular story is not an explosion. It's a choice. It is the scream that never left anyone's mouth and the small, final acts that follow. One morning he was gone. Not suddenly, not with dramatic packing, but with the subtlety of a page turned. His shoes were in the hall. His camera bag was on the chair. The bed had been made with the careful hands of someone trying to tidy an impression. On the coffee table was a note. I unfolded it with a tenderness that felt foolish. It read, "I wanted to keep you safe. I'm sorry for the ways I didn't. M." That is love shaped like an apology. It is also a sentence with a lot left unsaid. I called his number. It went to voicemail. I went to his favorite cafe. They said he'd been there 2 days ago and left early. I scoured photographs on his camera and found frames of the street, of a bench, of the door to my building. Interposed were images of me asleep on my couch, the light falling across my cheek like a benediction. There were images of the woman, taken from a distance, watching a storefront. There were images of him with her in arguments, mouths open, hands moving. There were images I did not understand. When he returned weeks later I had learned how to look at him with both gratitude and suspicion, an ambassador of my own heart. He came back as if nothing had changed, but of course everything had. He smiled and then his eyes slid to the window like someone expecting a guest. He sat and for the first time I asked him to tell me everything. He looked at me for a very long time, and then he exhaled like someone who had been holding his breath for years. He said he had a past that was heavy. He had been mixed up with people who liked information more than people. He'd pulled away because he was trying to quit watching. He'd stayed because he felt guilty for what he had been involved with. He swore he loved me. He admitted to the photographs. He apologized for thefts of privacy. He wanted me to forgive him for the way he had chosen to love. It sounded like confession. It sounded like a plea. The line between guardian and voyeur is often paper thin. He had, in trying to keep me safe from what, he didn't always say, encroached upon every small liberty I had. He had watched, photographed, counted, and curated my life into an exhibit he controlled. I should have left then. Maybe you would have. Maybe you would have called someone and burned all the photographs and never looked back. Maybe that's the sensible story. But here's the honest part, I didn't leave. Not right then. I forgave, in movements small and sincere. I forgave because he had pulled me from a long numbness. I forgave because the hand that traced my cheek would later become the hand that shook in the dark when we heard the tap at the window. I forgave because life is rife with reasons that outweigh logic. Forgiveness is not innocence. It's a quiet agreement to carry on with a scar. Weeks turned into a slow normal. He took fewer pictures. He laughed easier. The woman never returned. The watchers, if there ever were watchers, seemed to have lost interest or migrated to other radars. I liked to think the storm had passed. I liked to believe we could live in the brittle peace two flawed people make for themselves. Until the night the front door opened and another pair of footsteps entered behind Malik's, heavier, deliberate, not part of the pattern I had learned. I froze because the house had taught me to freeze at unfamiliar rhythms. Malik went quiet like a string being plucked too tight. He walked toward the door and out into the hall. I followed, barefoot like someone hunting for an answer. In the hallway stood the woman. She smiled at me then, and where her face should have been soft there was a seam. She held a child with the same stubborn eyes. Malik stood between us and said, "You shouldn't come here." He used a voice like someone who had chosen sides the way one chooses a weather. She looked at him and then looked at me, and said, in a small, even tone, "We watch because we love." It landed in the space between us like an accusation and a benediction at once. I realized in that moment that I had been surrounded by things I didn't fully understand. My life had become a landscape where people landed and took positions without asking if I would host them. There are endings where people run. There are endings where people swordfight in the street. This is not one of those endings. This ending is quieter, with the long, tender cruelty of being made to choose between safety and freedom. I made coffee that morning and put 3 cups on the table. We sat in a triangle with the sun cutting through the blinds like a judge waiting to make a ruling. The child played with a small tin soldier on the floor. The woman spoke in a voice that was worn from use. She told stories about how Malik had promised to leave. She said he had wanted better, but had been forced back into things by obligations that were older than him. She didn't ask me to believe her. She asked me, quietly, to accept the truth that people were complicated. I looked at Malik and saw not just the boy who had mended a gap in my life but the man who had kept 2 lives in his pockets like contraband. I looked at the woman and saw a creature of survival and a version of the person too young to forgive. I looked at myself and saw a person who wanted to be wanted and who discovered that wanting will sometimes cost you your privacy, your certainties, your sense of being sovereign. I cannot tell you how you should feel about that. What I can tell you is what I felt. I felt a heaviness like a final page. I felt a fierce clarity as if a lens had finally been wiped. I felt a sorrow for everyone who had been made small by circumstance. I felt the possibility of a life where truth did not live behind photographs. In the end, I asked Malik to leave for a while. Not forever, because I didn't have the anger for that. Not because I was cruel. Because I needed the space to understand who I had become in the presence of his choices. He left with his camera bag and the sweatpants I had once lent him. He stole a look at me that had both apology and a plea. I closed the door and for the first time in months I listened to the silence without searching for accompaniment. Months passed. He returned once, twice, to stand at the threshold. He came less often. When he did, we talked like people who've weathered a storm and then become cautious of weather. We did not make promises. We made tea and sat in the light and allowed ordinary things to be ordinary again, which is a fragile miracle. If you ask me if I regret it, the doors I opened, the nights I shared, the photos I allowed, I will tell you this: regret and gratitude can live in the same room. We can be grateful for what kept us from being completely hollow and still be angry that the cost was higher than we'd admit. When someone reaches into your life and rearranges it, there are new lines for you to walk along. You mend. You learn. You place a lamp where the dark was and you watch the glow. The watchers faded. The woman stayed away. The odd notes and the train ticket became a past that the house forgave. Malik learned steadiness. I learned how to keep my curtains closed sometimes. I learned how to demand what belonged to me. I learned the hard lesson that love can be a shelter and a trap. It's up to you to decide which it will be. If you've kept listening this long, thank you. Tell me in the comments, would you have let him stay? Would you have called out the watchers? When does protection cross the line into possession? I read every comment. Before I go, one last image. Me, at the window, the light soft as a promise, a camera on the shelf collecting a dust of ordinary life. Outside, the street moves on. Inside, there is a kettle that hisses like a small, reliable heartbeat. The silence is quieter now. Not golden, exactly. More honest. It doesn't pretend. If this story pulled at something inside you, share it. Subscribe for more quiet, strange stories about the ways people enter our lives and what they leave behind. And if you liked that slow, tense pull of a life rearranged, hit like. I promise I will keep telling them. Because in the end, stories are the only things that stay with us, the only witnesses that do not look away.